Welcome to the Clinical File. I'm John Cordray, and I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of the Jonathan Gerlach case. These are my speculations, it's not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. This is a really interesting and in a lot of ways bizarre case that has a lot of psychological layers that I know you're going to want to stick around to learn more about. What's the psychological bridge that must be crossed for a person to view a human life as a mere collectible? Is it possible for a mind to become so detached from social reality that it begins to find more comfort in the company of the deceased rather than the living? As we look at the arrest of Jonathan Gerlach in early 2026, we have to ask if this was a slow descent or a sudden psychological break. What drives an individual to meticulously curate a gallery of remains in their own basement? Could a profound lack of early childhood attachment create a void that only the permanent, unmoving presence of the dead can fill? And is the act of desecrating a grave a search for power or a desperate attempt to belong to a world that the perpetrator feels excluded from? We are looking at a case that challenges our understanding of hoarding, obsession, and the boundaries of the human psyche. How does a person justify the physical labor and the legal risk involved in transporting hundreds of remains into a residential neighborhood? Jonathan Gerlach, age 34, was taken into custody on January 6, 2026, in a quiet corner of Pennsylvania. The investigation began months earlier when authorities at Mount Moriah Cemetery noticed a series of calculated and violent disturbances. Mount Moriah is an abandoned cemetery, a place where nature has begun to reclaim the stone and the soil. From a clinical perspective, an abandoned cemetery is a potent metaphor for neglect. It's a place where the social contract with the dead has been broken by the living. For someone struggling with feelings of isolation, this environment might feel like a reflection of their own internal landscape. Starting around November 2025, reports surfaced of smashed mausoleums and open vaults. This was not random vandalism. It was a targeted effort to access the physical remains within. The first psychological indicator we see here is the high level of instrumental effort. Breaking into a stone vault requires significant physical strength and persistent focus. This tells us that the motivation behind these acts was not impulsive, but deeply driven by a specific goal. In mental health, we look at the difference between affective aggression and instrumental aggression. Affective is emotional in the heat of the moment, while instrumental is planned and goal-oriented. Gerlach's actions appear to be highly instrumental, suggesting a long-term obsession. When police conducted surveillance on January 6, they found Gerlach at the cemetery after dark. The discovery inside his vehicle provided the first glimpse into the scale of his activities. Skulls and skeletal remains were placed on the seats as if they were passengers. This lack of concealment is a major red flag for cognitive dissonance. Most individuals who commit crimes go to great lengths to hide the evidence. When a person leaves such taboo items in plain view, it suggests they no longer perceive the objects as wrong. They have normalized the behavior to the point where they believe others might not notice or even care. Or perhaps they have reached a state of psychological grandiosity where they believe that they are above the rules. In the burlap bag Gerlach was carrying, police found the remains of 2 children and 3 additional skulls. The inclusion of children's remains in his collection is perhaps the most distressing clinical element. It suggests a fixation on innocence or a desire to possess those who never had a chance to grow up. In forensic psychology, the choice of victims, even deceased ones, speaks to the perpetrator's internal conflicts. Was he trying to recreate a childhood that he felt was lost, or was he seeking the ultimate form of a compliant companion? The remains of a child represent a life cut short, and to keep them in a bag suggests a total dehumanization. Upon his arrest, Gerlach did not just confess. He walked officers to the specific graves that he had disturbed. This behavior can be seen as a form of pride in craftsmanship. In some individuals with narcissistic traits, there is a need to be recognized for their accomplishments, even if those accomplishments are illegal. He wasn't just a grave robber. In his mind, he was likely an expert or a curator. By showing the police his methods, he was validating his own identity as a collector. When the search moved to his home and a nearby storage unit, the sheer volume was staggering. Police found over 100 sets of human remains. This moves the case from simple grave robbing into a territory of extreme hoarding. Hoarding is often a response to a deep-seated fear of loss or abandonment. By keeping things, the individual creates a buffer between themselves and a world that feels unpredictable. When those things are human remains, however, this buffer is made for the most permanent objects imaginable. A bone does not change, it does not leave, it does not demand anything from you. For someone who finds human relationships difficult or painful, the dead are the perfect substitutes. Inside the home, the remains were not just stored, they were displayed. Bones were hanging on the walls and skulls were lined up on the shelves like trophies. This indicates a need to surround himself with his collection at all times. It suggests that his home was not just a living space, but a sanctuary for his fixation. One of the most jarring details was the discovery of a pacemaker still attached to a set of remains. This indicates that Gerlach was targeting relatively modern graves. This suggests that he wasn't looking for historical artifacts, but from the physical presence of the people who had recently lived. This proximity to the modern world increases the psychological tension of this case. It means that the families of those individuals are likely still alive and grieving. The total disregard for the emotional impact on the living is a strong indicator of a deficit of empathy. In clinical setting, we would examine if this deficit is a part of a larger personality structure, such as schizoid or antisocial traits. A schizoid individual often withdraws from the world and creates a rich internal fantasy life. If that fantasy life involves the dead, the transition to grave robbery becomes a way to bring the fantasy into reality. The physical state of the remains, some mummified, some skeletal, shows a lack of biological revulsion. Most humans have an evolutionary instinct to avoid decaying remains due to the risk of disease and a reminder of mortality. To overcome this instinct requires a significant psychological shift. It requires a process of desensitization, likely built up over many years of smaller infractions. We have to wonder what Gerlach's early life was like to lead him to this point. Was there an early exposure to death that wasn't properly processed? Or was there a profound sense of powerlessness that he sought to rectify by controlling the dead? Control is a central theme in many cases of grave desecration. The dead cannot resist, they cannot talk back, and they are the ultimate subject of a controller's will. By arranging the bones and hanging them from the walls, Gerlach was the master of his own small world. This world was safe from the complexity of social interaction and the threat of rejection. In the storage unit, the remains were kept in boxes, suggesting an overflow of his obsession. When a person's home can no longer contain their collection, it indicates a loss of control over the behavior. The behavior had become a compulsion that overrode his space, his finances, and his safety. The legal charges against him are extensive: burglary, abuse of a corpse, and desecration of a public monument. Over 500 charges in total, reflecting the massive scale of his activities. But the legal charges only tell us what he did. They don't tell us why he did it. From a mental health perspective, we look at the why as a way to understand the limits of human behavior. Was this a case of necrophilia in its broader non-sexual clinical sense? Fromm described necrophilia as a psychological attraction to all that is dead, decaying, and mechanical. It's a state of being where a person prefers things over people and the past over the future. In this framework, Gerlach's collection was an expression of a death-oriented personality. He was surrounding himself with the physical evidence of the end of life to avoid the challenges of living. The psychological impact on the families of the deceased is a form of communal trauma. A grave is meant to be a final boundary, a place where the living and the dead are separated by ritual and respect. When that boundary is smashed with a crowbar, it causes a profound sense of violation. The families must now deal with the reality that their loved ones were used as decor in a stranger's basement. This case also brings up the psychology of the hidden neighbor. Gerlach lived in a residential area, likely interacting with people on a basic level. How does a person maintain a facade of normalcy while living with 100 skeletons? The ability to lead a double life is a sophisticated psychological feat. It requires a high level of compartmentalization, which is the brain's ability to keep two conflicting sets of facts separate. One part of him was a neighbor and a citizen. The other was a nocturnal collector of the dead. This split can eventually lead to a psychological collapse where the two worlds are forced together by the law. The investigation is ongoing, with authorities working to identify the remains through medical records and DNA. The process of returning these individuals to their proper resting places is a form of restorative justice. It's a way for society to reestablish the boundaries that Gerlach broke. For Gerlach, the legal system will provide a different kind of structure. He is currently being held on high bond, facing the reality of his actions for the first time. In court, his mental state will likely be a central topic of discussion. Was he legally sane? Did he understand the wrongfulness of his actions? Based on his cooperation and his admission of knowing which graves he hit, it seems he was aware of the rules he was breaking. This makes the case even more fascinating from a clinical standpoint. It wasn't a lack of understanding. It was a choice to prioritize the fixation over the law. This suggests a personality where the self is placed entirely above the community. As a counselor, I often see how isolation can distort a person's reality. Without the check and balance of social interaction, a person's thoughts can become increasingly dark and eccentric. In Gerlach's case, the isolation seems to have been total, centered around his silent human collection. The fact that he focused on an abandoned cemetery like Mount Moriah is also significant. There is a psychological attraction to liminal spaces, places that are between two states. A cemetery is between life and death. An abandoned cemetery is between being cared for and being forgotten. Gerlach may have felt that he belonged in that in-between space. He was a man who didn't quite fit into the world of the living, so he made a home for himself among the forgotten. The aha moment in this analysis comes when we see the remains not as bones, but as a surrogate family. The jewelry is still attached, the pacemakers, the children. These are all links to a human identity that Gerlach wanted to keep close. He wasn't just stealing bones, he was stealing presence. He was trying to fill a soul-deep loneliness with the physical shells of others. But a bone can't provide the warmth of a living hand, and a skull cannot offer the sound of a voice. This is the ultimate tragedy of this case, the futility of the obsession. No matter how many remains he collected, the void inside him likely remained. The hearing coming up will likely reveal more about his history. We'll look for evidence of early trauma, or perhaps a significant loss that he was never able to grieve. If a person experiences a traumatic loss at a young age, they may develop a fixation on holding on to things. This can manifest as hoarding, or in extreme cases, what we see here. The case of Jonathan Gerlach is a dark mirror held up to our society. It shows us what happens when a person falls through the cracks and finds a home in the shadows. It reminds us that the human mind is capable of incredible things, both good and bad. And it reminds us of the sacredness of our final resting places. As the community heals, we must also look at how we can better support those who are struggling with isolation. Prevention is always better than prosecution. If we can identify these patterns of withdrawal and obsession early, perhaps we can intervene. But for now, the story of the grave robber stands as a testament to the power of the human fixation. It's a story of a man who looked at the dead and saw a collection. And it's a story of a community that had to reclaim its dignity from the basement of a stranger. The sheer scale of 100 sets of remains is something that will be cited for textbooks for decades. It's one of the largest cases of its kind in recent history. The logistical challenge of returning these individuals to their family is a massive undertaking. Each one represents a name, a life, and a story that was temporarily stolen. The process of forensic identification will bring closure to many, but it will also reopen old wounds. Psychologically, this is a case that will never truly be closed for the families involved. The violation of a grave is a permanent mark on the memory of the deceased. As we conclude this analysis, we are left with the image of Mount Moriah, a place of quiet now disturbed by the memories of the crowbars and burlap bags, and the image of a man in a cell, finally separated from his collection that defined his life. The clinical file on Jonathan Gerlach is just beginning to be written. Every court appearance and every psychological evaluation will add a new chapter. We'll continue to watch this case, not for the shock value, but for the understanding, because in the understanding, there's a way forward. We look for the red flags so we can recognize them in the world around us. We look for the why so we can build a world where the what doesn't happen again. One of the investigators had said that this investigation was like a horror story come to life. And I can see why. Can you imagine going into his home or going into the storage unit and seeing all those skeletal remains, the skulls up on the shelf? It reminds you of some of the people that we have talked about before on this channel. I think of Jeffrey Dahmer as one of them who collected human remains. And I think of Ed Gein, who collected skin and remains as well. This is rare, but it's not totally uncommon for someone to collect the remains. Thankfully, he didn't kill anybody, but he used the remains as a way of collecting and keeping a community around him. So what did you think about this case? Were there any elements that stood out to you? If you want more mental health analysis of true crime stories like this one, be sure to subscribe for more. And if you found this case compelling, be sure to watch this next story. It will make you more aware of your surroundings. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.